The horse shouldn't have been alive. That was the first thing Celeste thought when she saw it. Not fear, not wonder, but a cold, clinical certainty. She had lived on this land long enough to know what dying looked like. She'd seen it in the sky before a drought. She'd seen it in the eyes of a calf too weak to stand. She'd seen it in her husband's face the morning he didn't come back from the north pasture. And she was seeing it now, in the dark, in the middle of a storm that had no business being this violent in late October. The stallion stood at the edge of her fence line like something conjured from the black wall of rain. Lightning split the sky behind him, and for one breathless second she saw him whole, enormous, coat the color of charcoal ash, ribs carving visible ridges beneath skin that barely held together. His head hung low. One foreleg trembled under his own weight. His nostrils flared with effort that shouldn't have been this hard just to breathe. He was staring directly at her. Celeste stood on the porch with her lantern, the rain hammering the tin roof above her head, and she did not move for a long moment. Then she set the lantern down, walked back into the house, and came out carrying a bucket of feed. Before this story begins, I need to ask you something. If a wild horse appeared at your door during the worst storm of your life, starving and broken, and feeding it could cost you everything you had left, what would you do? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you believe kindness is never truly wasted, hit that like button right now. Let's begin. Her name was Celeste Drummond, and she was 34 years old, which felt like 104 on most mornings. The ranch was called Drummond Flats, though it hadn't been called much of anything by anyone else in the county for going on 2 years now. The men at the feed store in Calverton said it plain enough, not cruelly, just factually, the way West Texas men delivered verdicts. Asterisk, that woman can't hold that land alone. She'll be gone by spring. Asterisk, they'd been saying spring for 6 seasons. Celeste was still here. The land itself was 340 acres of red clay and scrub grass that grew defiant in spite of everything. In spite of the heat, in spite of the alkaline soil, in spite of the long stretches between rains that made the creek bed run white and cracked. Her husband, Thomas, had loved it with the kind of fierce, unreasonable loyalty that bordered on religious. He'd bought the eastern 40 acres with money they didn't have the year before he died, because he said he wanted their children to have room to grow. They didn't have children. They had the land. Celeste managed the ranch with 2 hired hands. Ezra, who was 63 and walked with a limp from an old argument with a fence post, and a young man named Cody who worked 3 days a week and spent the rest of the time on his family's claim 30 miles south. Neither of them was here tonight. The storm had rolled in fast, the way October storms did in this part of the state, with a deliberateness that felt personal. She had lived on Drummond Flats since the day she married Thomas, 9 years ago. She had come from a family of sharecroppers in East Texas, which meant she understood land the way people understand debts, as something owed, something that could be taken, something that required constant vigilance. Thomas had been a quiet man with large hands and a slow smile, the kind of man who fixed things without being asked and who listened without offering solutions. She had loved him the way you love steady ground, without thinking about it, because it was always there. Until it wasn't. The winter 2 years ago had been the worst in memory. Thomas had gone out in the 3rd week of December to check on the herd and hadn't come back before the temperature dropped below 0. They found him the next morning near the dry creek bed, his body half covered in ice, like the land had tried to preserve him for her. The doctor said he'd had a heart attack. She had always suspected it was something more complicated than that Thomas had simply made a decision out there in the dark and cold that she had never been able to fully forgive him for, even knowing it was irrational. Even knowing he hadn't chosen to leave, she still woke some nights reaching for his side of the bed. The neighboring ranchers, men like Harlan Voss, who owned the largest operation in the county, and Luther Crane, who controlled the water rights on 3 adjoining properties, had made their interest in Drummond Flats plain shortly after the funeral. First it was offers. Then the offers became suggestions. Then the suggestions developed edges. Harlan Voss had come to see her in March, 8 months after Thomas died, with his hat in his hands and his lawyer beside him like a quiet threat. He was a big man, red-faced, with white hair and the particular confidence of someone who had never in his life wanted for anything. "I'll give you a fair price," he told her. "More than fair. You could go somewhere comfortable, somewhere easier." "I'm comfortable here," she'd said. He'd looked around the kitchen, At the leaking corner of the ceiling, at the single lamp, at the cast iron stove that needed a new door latch. And he'd smiled the way men smile when they're being patient. "Suit yourself," he'd said. For now. That for now had lived in her chest ever since. She survived. She sold cattle when she had to, fixed fences herself when Ezra's leg gave out, learned to read the sky and the soil in ways Thomas had been trying to teach her for years. She became lean in ways that weren't just physical. She became careful. She became quiet. She became, in the eyes of most of Calverton County, invisible, which was fine. Invisible meant they underestimated her. She was thinking about none of this when she crossed the wet yard to the fence with the feed bucket, her boots sinking into the mud, her hair plastered flat against her face. She was thinking only about the horse, about the trembling in his legs, about the way his ribs moved with each labored breath, about how many hours he might have left if she didn't do something right now. She was thinking, he's out of time. She wasn't thinking about what feeding him would cost her. She stopped 6 feet from the fence and held the bucket out without speaking. The stallion didn't move. He watched her with eyes that were dark and enormous and completely, unsettlingly calm. Not wild, not panicked, but something more like exhausted patience. The rain hit his coat in sheets. A long scar ran across his left shoulder, old and pale, the kind left by something deliberate. "Easy," she said. Not loud, just enough to exist in the air between them. He lowered his head slightly. His nostrils opened. He was reading her, she realized. Not the bucket, not the feed, but her. Testing something she couldn't name. She moved one step closer, then another. Lightning came again, closer this time, and the thunder that followed was immediate and physical, a pressure in the chest more than a sound. Any horse she'd ever known would have bolted at that. This one didn't move. She reached the fence and rested the bucket on the top rail. He raised his head and looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he stepped forward. He was taller than she'd first judged, 17 hands at least, maybe more. Up close, the damage to his body was more visible. The hollowed-out flanks, the angular sharpness of his hip bones, the dried blood on his right knee from a wound she couldn't see clearly in the dark. His mane was matted with burrs and mud. He had been running hard for a very long time. He reached the bucket and began to eat. She stood there in the rain and watched him, and something happened in her chest that she hadn't felt in a long time. Not grief, not its opposite exactly, but something adjacent to both. A sense of weight being transferred. His exhaustion was so total and so honest that it moved her in the way honest things sometimes do. Past the place where you can analyze or protect yourself. After a few minutes, she went back to the barn and came out with more feed, a second bucket of water from the rain barrel, and an old horse blanket that had been Thomas's. She worked carefully, moving around him without rushing, keeping her voice low when she spoke. Not words, mostly, just sounds, the way you talk to something that is hurting and needs to hear that it isn't alone. The wound on his knee was worse than she'd thought. She cleaned it with what she had, water, a clean cloth, the last of the iodine from the medicine chest, and he stood for all of it without pulling away. Once, when she pressed too hard against the inflammation, she felt him tense, the muscle in his shoulder going rigid, but he didn't move his foot. He looked back at her once, briefly, and then looked away. He's been handled before, she thought. Asterisk, someone taught him to trust people. And then something happened that made him stop. Asterisk. She got him into the barn, the outer gate rather than the stall, open on both sides, so he wasn't trapped. She laid fresh hay and refilled the water. She pulled the blanket over him as well as she could, which wasn't perfect, but was something. Then she stood in the barn doorway and looked at him. He was eating steadily now, slowly, the way animals eat when they're too hungry to rush but too weak to be urgent. The lamp on the nail above the gate threw warm light across his coat, and in that light, he looked different than he had in the lightning. Less like a sign, more like a horse. Still extraordinary, but real. Tired and hurt and real. The brand on his right hip was something she didn't recognize. It wasn't any ranch mark she'd seen in the county, not any of the common patterns. It was 3 lines, diagonal, intersecting at a single point, like a compass that had decided only one direction mattered. She didn't think much about it that night. She went back inside, changed out of her soaked clothes, and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of water because she was too tired to boil coffee. She listened to the storm move east, its voice dropping from a roar to a murmur to a low percussion in the far distance. She thought about what she'd need to do in the morning. Check the fence line on the north side. See if the storm had opened any gaps. Assess the stallion in proper daylight. She thought briefly about whether he belonged to someone. Of course he did. A horse like that didn't exist without history. But tonight, in the storm, that history didn't matter. What mattered was the trembling in his legs and the hollow of his flanks and the look in his eyes when he'd tested her. She fell asleep at the table. When she woke, it was still dark, maybe 4 in the morning, and the storm was gone and the silence outside was total. She went to the window and looked out at the barn. The lamp was still burning. She could see, through the open gate, the dark shape of the stallion standing quietly in the hay. She went back to bed. She did not dream. Later, she would think about this moment, the last moment of quiet before everything changed, and she would not regret it. She would not wish she had chosen differently. She would only remember the strange, still peace of standing at the window in the dark, looking at the horse she had saved, not knowing yet what saving him would mean. That is the thing about kindness. It doesn't warn you. She heard them before she saw them. It was not yet 7 in the morning when the sound reached her, a low, continuous rumble that she mistook at first for another storm building to the south. She was in the kitchen, making coffee over the stove, still in her work clothes from before dawn, when the sound clarified itself. Not thunder. Horses. Many horses. And beneath them, wheels, wagons, or possibly several wagons, and the low, indistinct sound of voices carrying across flat land. She went to the front window. The road that ran along the eastern edge of Drummond Flats was a dirt track that saw perhaps 3 riders in a good week. Now it was filled, side to side, with men on horseback, and behind them came a loose collection of wagons and mules and men on foot, moving as one body in the direction of her gate. She couldn't count them from the window. She tried. She gave up at somewhere past 100. She went to the door and opened it and stepped onto the porch. The morning was clear and cold, washed clean by the storm. The light was flat and white, the kind that makes everything look like it's happening under glass. The procession had stopped at her gate, a wide wooden gate she kept locked with a chain, and at its front, on a dark bay horse, was Harlan Voss. Beside him was Luther Crane, and beside Luther was a man she didn't recognize immediately, younger, in a dark coat, with the kind of face that had learned early to give nothing away. She would later learn his name was Webb Alcott, and that he had come from a land company in Dallas with money enough to buy entire counties if the terms were right. Harlan didn't shout. He had a voice built for rooms and contracts, not fields, and he spoke at his normal volume, knowing she could hear him from the porch because sound carried out here, and he knew it. "Morning, Celeste. We need to talk about the horse." She said nothing. He shifted in his saddle. "We know he's here. About 30 men tracked him from the river last night. Good horse. Very particular horse." A pause. "That horse belongs to a matter of considerable importance, and we'd appreciate the chance to settle it today." She looked at the men behind him. Cowboys and ranchers she recognized. Men from town. Men she'd bought supplies from. Men whose names Thomas had known. And mixed among them, strangers. Hard-looking men with rifles across their saddlebacks who had not come from Calverton County. "He was injured," she said. "I gave him shelter for the night." Harlan nodded slowly, as if she'd said something reasonable that was nevertheless beside the point. "That's neighborly of you. Now we'd like to take him off your hands." "Who is we?" A small hesitation. "A group of interested parties." "That's not an answer." Luther Crane moved his horse forward a step. He was a narrow man, dry and precise, the kind who calculated interest in his head while talking about something else. "Celeste, you have a fence issue on your north line. Couple of your posts went down in the storm last night. Your cattle are liable to have wandered onto my property. That's a legal matter." He let that sit for a moment. Could get complicated. There it was. She understood the shape of what was happening now with a cold, complete clarity. They had come for the horse. They had come prepared with leverage. The fence, the cattle, and God knew what else they'd manufactured or discovered in the past 12 hours. They had come with numbers, because numbers were a kind of argument that didn't require words. She looked past them, out across the flat scrub land to the north and east, and she felt the size of the distance between her house and the nearest town, the nearest person who might help, the nearest anything. She had never felt the isolation of Drummond Flats the way she felt it at that moment. "The horse isn't ready to be moved," she said. "He's injured." "We have a man who can assess that," Harlan said. "I didn't say you could come in." The silence after that lasted long enough to have weight. Harlan looked at her with an expression that was almost paternal, almost sad, the expression of a man who has made a decision and is waiting for you to catch up with it. "We'll give you until noon," he said. "That's more than fair." He turned his horse and rode back toward the road. The men behind him didn't leave. They stayed. That was the thing she hadn't prepared for. Not confrontation, but occupation. The casual, grinding pressure of 200 men settling in along her fence line like they had nothing else to do and nowhere else to be. Some dismounted. Fires appeared at intervals along the road, small and practical, men cooking breakfast in the open air of her property line with an ease that said, "Asterisk, we have done this before. We know how long things take." Asterisk. Ezra arrived at 8:30, his old mule laboring up the track from the south, and he stopped at the edge of the gathering with the expression of a man who has walked into something he did not order. He came around to the back pasture gate and knocked, which was something he'd never done before. She let him in. "What in the Lord's creation?" he began. "The Stallion in the barn," she said. "Do you know that brand?" 3 diagonal lines, meeting at a point. He was quiet for longer than the question warranted. "Ezra, I've heard of it," he said carefully. "I've never seen it myself, but there are stories." He looked toward the barn. "There are stories about a group, been out in the hill country, somewhere past the Pecos, who run horses different from anyone else. Don't sell. Don't trade. Don't register with the state. Just run their herds and live how they've always lived." He paused. "The brand you're describing, 3 roads, 1 point. That's what I've heard it called. The direction you don't need to decide. It just is. Someone owns that horse. Someone raised that horse," Ezra said, which was not the same thing. She went to the barn. The Stallion was standing in the corner furthest from the gate, awake, alert, watching the south wall as though he could see through it to where the men were camped along her fence line. His breathing was better, still measured, but no longer labored. The wound on his knee had stopped weeping. He had eaten everything she'd left him. When she came in, he turned to look at her. She stood in the middle of the barn for a moment, hands at her sides. "I don't know what you are," she said quietly. "I don't know what any of this means." He lowered his head once, very slightly. The gesture was too deliberate to be accidental and too precise to be animal instinct, and it unsettled her in a way she chose not to examine. She went back out. Around 10 o'clock, 3 of the strangers, the hard-faced men with rifles, walked her fence line slowly, examining the posts and the wire, writing in a small book. They didn't speak to her. They didn't look at her. They just walked and wrote and walked, as though conducting an inventory of something they were preparing to acquire. She watched from the porch. Cody arrived at 11, breathless from riding hard from the south when he'd heard in town, and he hitched his horse out of sight of the road and came to stand beside her on the porch. "You're not going to give them the horse," he said. It wasn't a question. "No." He nodded slowly. He was 22, with a young man's uncomplicated sense of right and wrong that she sometimes envied. "Then what do we do?" "I don't know yet." She was aware, in the back of her mind, of something she couldn't quite locate, a feeling she'd been having since she'd woken up, a sense of being observed from a direction she hadn't identified. Not from the road, not from the east, where the men were camped, from somewhere higher and further back. She'd scanned the tree line twice and found nothing, and she'd told herself it was nerves and the strangeness of the morning. At 11:30, a boy appeared at the gate. Couldn't have been older than 12, in rough clothes, on a small brown horse. He had a look in his eyes that didn't match his age, watchful, deliberate, as though he'd ridden a very long way and knew exactly where he was going. "Ma'am," he said through the gate, "the men watching from the ridge wanted me to tell you something." She went very still. "What men?" "They said, the horse knows the way home. They said, if you let him go tonight, he'll be safe. They said," the boy paused, as though reciting something he'd been given to memorize. "They said, don't make a trade you can't undo." He turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come, not hurrying, not looking back. Celeste stood at the gate for a long time. Men watching from the ridge. She'd felt it, but dismissed it. It was real. There were people up there, invisible, watching everything that happened below. The men at the fence, the fires, the strangers with their notebooks. Watching her. She turned the message over in her mind. Don't make a trade you can't undo. It could mean give up the horse. It could mean don't give up the horse. It could mean something she hadn't thought of yet. What it definitely meant was, you are being watched, and whoever is watching has already decided something about you, and they are waiting to see if they were right. At noon, Harlan Voss rode back to her gate. "Time's up," he said. She stood on her porch and looked at the mass of men behind him, and she felt the weight of everything Thomas had worked for pressing against her back. The land, the house, the East 40 he'd bought the year before he died. And she breathed in once, slowly, and she said, "Come back tomorrow." With a judge, not writers. His jaw tightened. "Celeste, that's my answer. Come back tomorrow." He came back that afternoon instead, alone this time, which was worse. Not Voss, the young man in the dark coat, Webb Alcott. He came to her back door, which meant he'd come around the property, which meant he'd been watching the layout long enough to know where the approaches were. She opened the door before he knocked. He was younger than she'd first thought, maybe 28. He had quiet eyes, the kind that gathered information without appearing to. A tool, she thought, not a weapon. Weapons announced themselves. "I'm not with Voss," he said. "Not exactly." "Then who are you exactly with?" He hesitated. "A company called Meridian Land and Trust, out of Dallas. We've been watching this territory for acquisition for about 18 months. Watching my land, watching several properties. Yours is significant. The water table under your East 40 is unusually deep. There are men who'd pay a great deal for access to that." She looked at him. "I'm telling you this because Voss doesn't know I'm here," he continued. "He thinks he's going to collect that horse and use it as a pretext to start a legal dispute over your fence and your cattle, and then bury you in costs until you sell. That's his plan. He's done it twice in this county and once in the next one over. And your plan? A beat. My company would offer twice what Voss offered. Clean sale, no litigation. You'd walk away with enough to start somewhere better." She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved across the yard and lifted a small funnel of dust near the fence post and put it down again. "Who sent the boy with the message?" she asked. Something moved across his face, surprise, quickly covered. "What boy?" "The boy at the gate. Around 11:30. He shook his head. "I don't know what you're talking about." She believed him, which meant the people on the ridge were entirely separate from Voss, from Alcott, from Meridian Land and Trust. A fourth party she had no map for, with their own interests and their own calculations, and a horse that apparently mattered enough to generate all of this. "You said the horse is significant," she said. "Why?" Another hesitation. Longer this time. "The land, primarily." "You said the horse," she said. "Not the land." He looked at her steadily. He had the look of a man reconsidering something. "There are stories," he said finally, "about the people who use that brand. The 3 lines. There are stories that say wherever those horses go, the land around them tends to do unusually well. Water where there wasn't water. Grass through drought." He paused. "I'm a businessman. I don't believe in stories like that. But your company sent you anyway." "My company sent me because Harlan Voss is moving on a property that Meridian has already evaluated, and we don't like being outrun." He picked up his hat from the railing where he'd set it. "But I thought you should know what Voss is planning. What you choose to do with that is yours." He walked back around the house. She stood in the doorway for a long time, looking at the barn. 3 lines, 1 point. Asterisk the direction you don't need to decide. It just is, asterisk. Water under the East 40. Stories of grass through drought. A horse that had walked through a storm in the direction of her land specifically, out of the hundreds of miles of open West Texas available to it. She went to the barn. The stallion was watching the south wall again. She followed his gaze as if she might see what he saw. Outside, faint against the afternoon sky, she made out 2 figures on horseback on the ridge to the northwest. Still, patient. They had been there all day. They were not hiding. They were not threatening. They were simply present, the way a fact is present. Not argued, not negotiated, just there. "They're waiting to see what I do," she thought. And she still didn't know what that was going to be. The next morning, Harlan Voss came with more men than before. She had not slept. She had sat at Thomas's desk through the night, going through the deed, the water rights, the fence survey from 3 years back, the notes from the county land office that Thomas had kept in a tin box under the floorboard because he'd never fully trusted banks or filing offices. She read everything twice. The fence line on the north side was hers. The water rights on the East 40 were hers, clear and registered. The deed was in her name now. Thomas had transferred it 4 months before he died, a decision she'd thought was premature at the time and now recognized as foresight. She was not legally vulnerable. Not yet. But legally was a small shield against the kind of pressure Voss was building. When she heard the sound from the road again at 6:30, she already had her coat on. There were more of them this time. She counted beyond 200 before she stopped. They had brought a wagon with supplies, which meant they were prepared to stay. 3 of the hard-faced men she'd seen before were back, but now there were others with them. Men she didn't recognize at all, in clothes that weren't local. Hired hands from somewhere else, brought in for an occasion that warranted personnel. And a man on the back of the wagon with a cage. The cage was built for a horse. She'd never seen one built for that purpose, but the scale was unmistakable. Heavy iron, bolted to a flatbed, with a gate designed for a large animal. Whoever had ordered that had done so before the first morning, which meant they'd known the stallion was coming here, or suspected it, before she'd even made the decision to feed him. Ezra came around the corner of the barn and stopped when he saw her face. "They've got a transport cage," she said. He was quiet. Luther Crane pushed his horse through the gate. They had broken the chain, she noticed, sometime in the night, and rode up her drive with the casual ease of a man who had already decided the property was no longer hers. He stopped 20 yards from the porch. "We're going to need access to the barn," he said. "Today, this is no longer a request." "On whose authority?" He reached into his coat and produced a document. Judge Hensley and Calverton signed this before first light. Temporary access order pending resolution of the fence and livestock dispute. You can contest it, but the proceeding isn't scheduled for 30 days, and in 30 days. In 30 days the water table will be surveyed, and the value of my East 40 will be on record, she said. Which is what you need before you can make a legal claim to it. Luther's expression didn't change. He was good at that. "I'd encourage you not to make this more difficult than it needs to be." Cody was behind her now. She'd heard him ride up. And Ezra was to her left. 3 people against however many were on her drive, and along her fence line, and probably already around the back. She calculated, about 4 choices. She could give them the horse. They would leave, for now, and come back in 30 days for everything else. She could refuse, and they would force entry, and it would be her word against a signed order from a judge who was almost certainly in Harlan Voss's pocket. She could send the horse out now, tonight, somehow, open the barn gate and let him run, but the men along the fence line would catch him before he reached the ridge. Or she could do the thing that had been forming in the back of her mind since the boy with the message, since she'd seen the figures on the ridge. She could do the thing that Thomas would have said was reckless and that she was beginning to think was the only honest option left. She could ask for help from the people who were watching. She didn't know how. She didn't know if they would respond. She stood on the porch in the cold morning light with Luther Crane waiting on his horse and 200 men at her back, and she made a decision that had nothing to do with tactics or legal documents. She made the decision she had been circling since midnight, the one she'd been afraid to commit to because it required her to believe in something she couldn't prove. She believed the horse had come to her for a reason. She believed the people on the ridge already knew what kind of woman she was and were waiting for her to prove them right or wrong. She turned and walked into the barn. The stallion raised his head when she came in. She went to the south wall, the wall he'd been watching, and she pushed open the wide rear door that looked toward the ridge. Then she stood beside the horse and waited. She didn't know for what. She only knew that she was not going to hand him over. Not to Voss, not to Crane, not to the cage on the flatbed wagon. Behind her, she heard Luther Crane's voice. "Last chance, Celeste." She didn't turn around. She had never thought of herself as brave. Thomas had been brave. He'd been the kind of man who saw what was right and moved toward it without much deliberation, because deliberation cost time and time cost people. She had always been the one who thought too long, who turned things over, found the angles, calculated the risk. He used to say it affectionately. "Celeste, you'd think twice about breathing if you thought it would help." She'd always taken it as a compliment, even when he hadn't meant it as one. Brave was easy when you had nothing to lose. She had something to lose. She had everything to lose. She stood in the barn and felt that weight press against her from every side. The land, the debt, the memory of Thomas's face in the cold, the years of fence repairs and sleepless summers and dry seasons that had taken more from her than they'd given back. She felt the loneliness of it, the particular and total loneliness of a woman who has kept something alive through sheer refusal and is now standing at the exact moment that refusal becomes a choice she can't walk back. She could give up the horse and keep the land, probably, for 30 days. And then they would come back with another order and another pretext, and she would give up another piece, and then another, because that was how it worked. She understood now what she'd understood theoretically before, but had managed to deny. They were never going to stop. Giving them the horse was not a solution. It was a first step in a process that ended with her standing at the road with a deed in her hand that nobody would honor and nowhere to go. Or she could hold the line here. Now, with 3 people and a horse and whatever was watching from the ridge. She pressed her hand against the stallion's flank. He was warm. He had eaten everything she'd left him, and his breathing was even now, steady, the frightening tremor in his legs gone. He was recovering. He was strong. Whatever had broken him down out there in the land before he found her fence, weather, pursuit, something else, it had not broken what was essential in him. She thought about the night she'd brought the feed bucket out in the storm. She'd done it without thinking, because he was hurt and hungry and there in front of her, and that had been enough. She hadn't thought about consequence. She hadn't calculated. She'd just done the thing that was obviously right. Somehow that simple act had brought 200 men to her gate, and a transport cage for an animal that apparently meant something large and complicated to people she'd never met. Somehow that simple act had also brought watchers to the ridge, people who apparently believed her capable of something worth observing. She was afraid. She was deeply, physically afraid. A fear that was different from the fear of drought or debt because it was immediate and personal, and there were armed men 20 yards away who had come prepared. But there was something else under the fear. Not courage exactly. Something older than courage. The thing that had kept her on this land for 2 years after Thomas died, through all the seasons that tried to shake her loose. A refusal that wasn't about being strong. It was about knowing who she was and not being willing to stop being that person just because it was expensive. Luther Crane had come to the barn door. She heard him stop there, not crossing the threshold, for whatever reason. Maybe even he had a line he didn't cross. Maybe it was something else. Celeste. His voice was different now. Quieter, less formal. I've known you for 6 years. I knew Thomas. He was a good man. A pause. This horse is going to cause you more trouble than he's worth. He's caused trouble everywhere he's been. Let these men take him and let the rest of this go. You can hold your land. The water thing, that's just Voss's idea. If you cooperate today, I can make sure that survey doesn't happen. You have my word. She said nothing. I'm not your enemy, he said. I know, she said. And she did know. He wasn't cruel, Luther. He was practical, and he had made practical calculations that had aligned him with Voss, and it was possible he even believed what he was saying about protecting her. The problem was that his protection would require her to be the kind of person she wasn't. Thomas would have taken the deal, Luther said. She turned around. She looked at him in the doorway, slight, dry Luther Crane, with his reasonable face and his judge's order, and she felt a flash of something she almost never let herself feel. Anger, clean and simple and precise. Thomas is dead, she said, and I am not Thomas. Luther looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, in a way that wasn't agreement but was something, acknowledgement, maybe. Recognition of a line crossed. Voss won't wait much longer, he said. Then he won't wait, she said. He left. She turned back to the stallion. He was watching the open door to the south, the ridge, the distance. She followed his gaze, and this time she saw clearly 3 riders on the ridge, where there had been 2 yesterday. They had moved closer. Not close enough to be on her land. Close enough to be visible without trying. One of them raised a hand. Not a wave. Something quieter. An acknowledgement. She had been seen. She had been tested. She had not yet been answered. And somewhere in the distance, moving down the road from the north with the sound of wagons and horses, she heard Harlan Voss returning. The real confrontation had not yet begun. Everything until now had been preparation, the kind you go through when you're building up to something that you can't take back. She reached up and took the old rifle from the wall above the stall gate. She was not going to shoot anyone. She was not going to threaten. But she was going to stand in this barn with her hand on that stock and make it plain, in the only language left available to her, that the horse behind her was not going to that cage. Harlan Voss came into the barn himself. That surprised her. She'd expected more proxies, more legal language, more of the slow, grinding bureaucratic pressure that he was good at. Instead, he came alone, at 11 in the morning, with his hat in his hand and his lawyer and Luther and 4 riders waiting outside. And he walked into her barn with the quiet confidence of a man who has decided to handle a thing personally. He looked at the stallion. Something crossed his face. Admiration, briefly, and then something harder underneath it. Calculation. That's a remarkable animal, he said. She stood beside the horse with the rifle low. "What does a horse like that mean to you?" he asked. Not hostile, genuinely curious, as if he were trying to understand a decision that didn't make sense to him from the outside. "He's in my care," she said. "He came to you by accident, in a storm. He's not yours, and he's not mine. And frankly, he belongs to people who are likely going to cause you a great deal of trouble before this is over, whether you hand him over or not." His voice was measured, reasonable. The voice of a man who has been told he is reasonable so many times he stopped questioning it. "What I'm offering you is a clean end to this. Today, walk away from the horse, and I will let the survey and the fence dispute die. That's my word." "Your word," she said. "My word." She looked at him. He was a man who had gotten everything he'd ever wanted through a combination of money, patience, and the strategic application of other people's fear. He was not a bad man in the way that cruel men are bad. He was bad in the ordinary way, the way that accumulates without drama, through small betrayals and quiet usurpations, through looking away at the right moments and arriving at the right moments in force. "If I give you the horse," she said, "what happens to him? He'll be resold, at a significant profit. That's not your concern." "To whom?" A pause. "Buyers who have already expressed interest." "The land company," she said. "Meridian." His expression shifted very slightly. She'd caught him. Webb Alcott had told her. He hadn't expected her to have that information, and now the calculation in his eyes was adjusting, recalibrating. "Give me the horse, Celeste," he said quietly. "And this ends today." She looked at the stallion. He was watching her, not Voss. Her. His dark eyes were absolutely steady, completely present, without fear or plea, just that same quality she'd noticed in the storm, that exhausted patience, that sense of something waiting to be resolved. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the East 40 he'd bought the year before he died. She thought about the night she'd found him by the creek, the cold, the silence, her own voice breaking in the dark, asking him questions he couldn't answer. She thought about the bucket of feed in the storm. The simplest thing. The only obvious thing. She looked at Voss. "No," she said. He was quiet for 3 seconds. "I was hoping you'd be sensible," he said. And then he turned and walked out of the barn. And when he reached the door, he said, without looking back, "Boys." The 4 riders entered. She raised the rifle. "Nobody move," she said. They stopped. From outside, she heard shouting, not from Voss's men, but from somewhere else, distant at first, and then suddenly not distant. The sound of hooves coming fast, not from the road but from the northwest, from the direction of the ridge. She heard one of the men outside say something sharp and startled. She heard horses reacting. The 4 riders in the barn looked toward the door. She walked to the south entrance, the open one facing the ridge, and looked out. They were coming down. A dozen riders, moving at speed, with the kind of deliberate, controlled purpose that wasn't a charge but wasn't a hesitation either. They came down the slope and across the flat scrub land toward her fence line, and they came in silence. No shouting, no guns raised, just the sound of horses and the sight of them moving through the dry October grass toward the confrontation that had been building since the morning she'd brought a bucket out in the rain. She lowered the rifle. The test was over. The riders from the ridge were not what she'd expected. She had imagined, vaguely, without letting herself commit to it, something dramatic. Something that would resolve the situation with the clarity and finality of a story reaching its end. What arrived instead was quieter and stranger, and in some ways more powerful because of it. There were 14 of them, men and women both, which surprised her. She had assumed, in the way that the time and place assumed, that this would be men's business. They were dressed for the land, not for display, practical clothes, good horses, no uniforms or markings beyond the brand that some of their horses carried. The 3-line brand. Several of the horses she recognized as the same general type as the stallion. Large, dark, built for endurance. Their leader was a woman. She was perhaps 50, with a face that had been a long time in the sun and wind, brown skin, dark hair wound back beneath a plain hat. She rode without visible effort, the way people ride who have spent more of their life on horseback than off it. She stopped her horse at the fence line and looked across at Celeste and said nothing. Harlan Voss turned his horse slowly. He stared at the woman for a long moment. Something in his posture changed, not collapse, but recalibration. He recognized what this was. "This is private property," he said. The woman looked at him the way you look at something that is speaking but that you have already decided is not worth responding to. Then she looked past him at the transport cage on the wagon. She said something in a language Celeste didn't recognize, quietly, to the rider beside her. He turned and rode back up the ridge. "You have no authority here," Voss said. "Neither do you," the woman said. Her English was accented but precise. "Not over that horse. We have a court order. For fence access," she said. "Not for the horse. Not for this woman's barn. Not for this land." She let that sit for a moment. "Bring a lawyer." Voss stared at her. Luther Crane moved his horse up beside Voss and said something low, and Voss's jaw tightened. The men along the fence line had gone very still, not because they were afraid, exactly, but because they were watching a situation transform into something none of them had prepared for, and the body reacts to uncertainty before the mind catches up. The 4 riders in Celeste's barn had come out, quietly, without being told. They were standing in the yard. Their rifles were on their saddles. Celeste came out onto the porch. She looked at Voss. She looked at the woman on the horse at her fence line. She looked at the 200 men distributed across her property and her road and her land. She felt a thin, precarious thing settling. Not safety, not victory. Something more like the moment before a decision becomes permanent. The moment when you can still feel the shape of all the different ways things could have gone. Voss looked at her. "This isn't over," he said. "I know," she said. He turned his horse and rode down the road, and slowly, not all at once, but in the reluctant way of things that have run out of immediate options, the men followed him. The cage wagon turned around with difficulty in the narrow road. The fires were kicked out. The watchers departed. It took nearly an hour for the road to be empty. When it was, the woman at the fence line was still there. The woman's name was Nora. She said it without preamble, dismounting at the gate and leading her horse inside when Celeste opened it, as though she had done this before and expected to be admitted. She had the quality of someone who operated in a register below drama. Everything measured, nothing wasted. They sat on Celeste's porch while the other riders stayed at the fence line, watchful and quiet. Nora accepted a cup of water and held it in both hands without drinking it immediately, which seemed like a kind of habit. "How did you know about the water?" Celeste asked. Nora looked at her carefully. "We've known about your East 40 for a long time. Before Voss did, before the land company." A small pause. "The horse knew." Celeste said nothing. "I'm not speaking in mystery," Nora said, and there was something almost dry in her voice. The patience of someone who has said things too large to be easily believed and has learned to say them plainly and wait. "I mean, the horses are sensitive to groundwater. It's in how they move, where they stand, how they rest. This one," she looked toward the barn, "he found your fence line and stopped. They don't do that for nothing." Celeste thought about the nights in her first year here when she'd watched the cattle drift toward the East 40 in drought conditions, toward grass that was somehow greener than the rest. She'd thought it was the lay of the land. "How long have you been watching?" she asked. "Since he left us. 3 weeks ago." A pause. "He does this. Goes out alone. Far. We track him because he finds things. Water, safe passage, occasionally people." "People." Nora looked at her steadily. "People who might be useful. People who need to be found. Both." She set the cup down. "You fed him in a storm. You refused to hand him over when it would have benefited you. You asked nothing from us." A quiet beat. "We pay attention to those things." Celeste looked out at the land, hers and Thomas's, with its alkaline topsoil and its scrub grass and its deep water that Voss had almost gotten to. The East 40 that Thomas had bought the year before he died, because he'd wanted room for children they never had. She felt something she didn't entirely trust yet, something warm and unguarded, and therefore dangerous. She'd learned not to feel that too fast. "What does paying attention mean, in practical terms?" she asked. Nora almost smiled. "It means we know every approach to your north and east fence lines. It means the men who came today know that now. It means Voss will hire lawyers instead of riders next time, which is slower and more expensive and leaves a paper trail." Another pause. "It also means that if you want to know where the water is on your East 40, exactly where, we can show you. Properly mapped, documented. Your mineral rights, your water claim, your future." She stood. Hard to steal land from a woman when the value of it is already in the public record. Celeste sat very still. Thomas had said something once, near the end, when they'd been talking about the East 40 and whether the purchase had been wise. He'd said, "The only real security is being worth protecting." She hadn't known what he meant. She thought she was beginning to. She looked at Nora. "Thank you," she said. It was inadequate, but it was true. 3 nights later, They came back for the land itself. Celeste woke to the smell of smoke. She was out the door before she was fully conscious, barefoot on the porch, and she saw it immediately. Orange light moving at the edge of the north fence line, low and spreading. Not a natural fire. The storm had left everything wet enough that grass wouldn't catch on its own. This was deliberate. Someone had brought fuel. She shouted for Ezra and ran for the water barrel. The fence line burned in 3 places, spaced apart, which meant multiple people, which meant planning. She understood what it was. Not destruction for its own sake, but a message. Asterisk you won. That round. Here is what we can still do to you. Asterisk. They worked until 2 in the morning. She and Ezra and Cody, who had ridden over when he'd seen the glow from his place to the south, and Nora and 2 of her riders who had apparently been camped nearby and arrived without being called. 6 people with buckets and wet sacks against 3 separate fires in dry enough brush. They contained it. The north fence line was gone in one section, 40 feet of post and wire that would need replacing. No animals lost. The barn was untouched. The house was untouched. The east 40, which was furthest from the north line, was untouched. When the last flame was out and the smoke thinned into the cold night air, Celeste stood in the dark and looked at the burned section. The fence posts were black stubs. The wire had curled and contracted in the heat. She was shaking, not from cold, from aftermath. That particular tremor that comes when the body has been running on emergency for hours, and the emergency has passed, and the nervous system doesn't know what to do with itself. Nora stood beside her. "This won't be the last thing he does," Celeste said. Her voice was flat, practical. She'd moved past fear into something that was tired but clear. "No," Nora agreed, "but it'll leave a record." Yes. Celeste thought about Alcott, the young man from the land company who had come to warn her, who she hadn't entirely trusted but hadn't entirely dismissed. A deliberate arson against a landholder with clean deed papers and water rights and witnesses who were neither local nor easily intimidated. That was a paper trail that even a county judge in Voss's pocket would have trouble burying. Voss had just made a mistake. She let out a long breath. The smoke taste was in her throat. Her hands were blistered from the buckets. The night was very cold and very dark, and the burned fence line was a raw wound in the land she loved. "We fix it in the morning," she said. She turned and walked back toward the house. Spring came to Drummond Flats that year with the kind of abundance that made people say the land itself was making a point. The water survey went on record in February, 9 days after Alcott, in a decision that surprised everyone, including Celeste, came to her door and offered to fund the filing himself, in exchange for a deposition regarding the events of October and November that his company's lawyers needed for an unrelated matter concerning Harlan Voss. She had signed, and he had filed, and the water rights under the East 40 were now documented and registered and very much public, which made them essentially impossible to steal without the kind of legal spectacle that men like Voss preferred to avoid. Voss made 3 more attempts. 2 were legal, procedural challenges that found no purchase, reviewed by a circuit judge from San Antonio who had no relationship with the county and no patience for what she described in her written ruling as a pattern of targeted civil harassment. The 3rd was not legal. 2 men on the road one evening who made it clear they'd been sent to frighten her. And that attempt ended badly for the men when Nora's riders came out of the dark with a calmness that was somehow more terrifying than aggression. Voss didn't come back after that. The north fence went up stronger than before, better posts, tighter wire, Ezra's design, which he claimed was the way it should have been built to begin with. She paid him better. She hired Cody full-time. She made 2 improvements to the house that Thomas had always meant to make. And in late April, the Stallion left. He simply wasn't there one morning. The outer gate she'd always left openable for him. Because he'd never been hers, she'd understood that from the beginning, was standing open in the early light, the hay she'd left the night before untouched. She went out and looked at the tracks in the soft spring mud, leading northwest, toward the ridge. She stood there for a while. She wasn't sad. She was something she didn't have a precise word for, something that was partly loss and partly rightness, the feeling of a thing completing itself the way it was meant to. He had come to her fence in a storm, and she had fed him, and that had cost her almost everything. And then it had given her most of it back, and more. She thought about Thomas, about the East 40 he'd bought with money they didn't have, about the things he'd known that she'd had to learn the long way. She thought about what it meant to protect something, not because it was yours, not because someone was watching, Not because you'd get something back, but because it was the only honest thing to do with the moment you were standing in. She'd heard from Nora, who visited occasionally, that the horse moved through the hill country like a kind of slow survey, finding water, finding passage, occasionally finding people. That he was healthy, that the knee had healed cleanly. She was glad. The spring that year pushed through the soil of the East 40 with a vigor that made Ezra stand in the middle of the pasture with his hat in his hands and look at the grass the way people look at things they are glad to have lived long enough to see. Thomas would have crowed about this for a year, he said. He would have, she said. She looked out over the land, all 340 acres of it, green and real and hers. The sky was vast and blue, and the wind moved the grass in long, slow waves from west to east, like something breathing. She had never thought of herself as brave, but she had stood in a barn with a rifle and refused to give something away that wasn't hers to give. That, she thought, was enough. Celeste never forgot the night she carried a bucket of feed out into the storm. She never made it into more than it was, a simple act, done because it was obvious and because she was the kind of person who couldn't do otherwise. But that act changed everything that came after. If this story moved something in you, if you believe that what we protect when no one is watching says more about us than what we do in the light, then leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if you would have made the same choice. Stories like this one survive because people carry them forward. If Celeste's courage meant something to you, share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe. You belong here. And until next time, stay on your land, no matter what it costs.